The seat holds the shape of someone else. That is the first thing she notices, the way the cracked vinyl has settled into the impression of a person who is not her, shoulders and spine, and the patient weight of hands resting on a lap for years of flight. She fits into it anyway, because the desert outside the cockpit windshield is doing something worth watching. The airstrip catches the last horizontal light at an angle that makes it look freshly poured, pale and deliberate against the darker scrub, and the shadows of the creosote bushes stretch east in long blue lines, precise as ruled marks on survey paper. The mountains behind the valley are going purple. The sky above them is the color of a coal fire dying. She sits with her hands on her knees and does not move. 6 weeks ago, she did not know this airplane existed. 6 weeks ago, she was walking a dirt road that the county map labeled a route, but that bore every mark of being forgotten. Wheel ruts filling with blown sand, a cattle gate rusted permanently open, a stretch of telephone wire sagging so low between two posts that a tall person would have to duck. She had been walking since before sunrise, which is a thing you do when you have no particular reason to stop. Her canvas bag rode her left shoulder, the strap worn soft as old rope, and everything she owned was in it. 2 changes of clothes, a rain poncho, a folding knife, a box of matches, a road atlas with 3 pages missing, $41 and change, and a paperback so read through the cover had separated from the spine and been folded flat inside the front pocket. Silver Mesa was 11 miles back. She had stopped there 2 nights, sleeping in the county park pavilion until someone politely asked her not to, and she had bought crackers and a tin of sardines at the gas station mart and studied the map on the corkboard near the register. The map showed open BLM land spreading south and east into a wide plainland of scrub and hardpan. No towns, no marked roads except the one she was now walking. The woman behind the register had told her the nearest work was 30 miles west at a produce packing operation that might or might not be hiring. She was not walking toward the packing operation. She was walking because moving felt better than stopping, and because stopping had rarely been kind to her, and because the desert that morning was copper and ochre and entirely indifferent to where she was going, which made it easier somehow. She smelled the airplane before she saw it. Aviation fuel does not vanish from metal, even after 20-odd years of sun and wind. It lives in the seams and rivets, in the rubber seals along the cargo doors, in the floor plates above the tanks. The smell came to her on a shift in the morning breeze, thin and chemical and strangely purposeful, and she stopped walking. She turned off the road. There was no decision in it, not exactly. The smell pulled her the way a sound pulls the head before the mind has named it, involuntary, animal, precise. She stepped off the gravel shoulder into the scrub and pushed through the first stand of creosote, the waxy branches dragging at her canvas bag, and walked toward whatever was producing that thin chemical signature on the morning air. She almost walked into the wing before she saw it. It came out of the brush at shoulder height, a broad aluminum surface, sun-blasted to the color of old bone along its upper edge, still carrying faint traces of olive-drab paint in the shadow beneath. She stopped, looked left along its leading edge, looked right. The wing was enormous, wide enough that she could not see where it ended in either direction without walking. She put her hand flat against the underside and felt rivets under her palm, and a warmth that was the metal absorbing the morning sun, and she stood there for a moment, as if she needed the confirmation of touch to believe what her eyes were giving her. She ducked under the wing, and the full shape of the airplane assembled itself around her. Twin propellers, both feathered, their blades darkened by oxidation and pointing at the sky like the spokes of something interrupted. A fuselage perhaps 70 feet long, she guessed. Though she had no good frame of reference, it was simply the largest machine she had ever stood beside. The olive-drab paint had gone pale and scoured on every surface that faced the sun, but in the creases between panels and along the belly it survived in dark patches, and she could make out beneath the oxidation what might once have been a company name stenciled in black, now illegible. The landing gear was down and solid. The tires were cracked and partially deflated, but had not surrendered completely. The plane had not crashed. It had been put here, or left here, and then the desert had done what the desert does. It had grown around it patiently. Brittlebush pressing against the fuselage on the starboard side, a creosote large enough to be decades old crowding the nose from the left. She circled the entire aircraft once before she touched anything else. She walked slowly, dragging one hand along the fuselage every few paces, reading the surface the way you might read a face, looking for damage, for weakness, for information. The skin was intact. No collapse, no rupture. One small window on the port side was cracked through but not gone. The cargo door on the starboard side had its handle rusted into position. She worked the handle for 4 minutes, using a flat stone she found in the hardpan as a lever against the latch mechanism, before something gave with a sound like a joint popping, and the door swung outward into the desert air. The smell that came out was old and sealed and entirely dry. She climbed in. The cockpit came first. She moved forward through the cargo hold, trailing her fingers along the corrugated aluminum wall, and ducked through the forward bulkhead door into the flight deck. The 2 pilot seats were still there, high-backed, upholstered in cracked brown vinyl that had dried and split along every seam. The instrument panel stretched the full width of the nose, altimeter, airspeed indicator, artificial horizon, oil pressure gauges for 2 engines, a radio stack that had gone entirely dark and silent sometime before she was born. Cobwebs filled the spaces between the switches in thick architectural ropes, the kind that accumulate over years rather than seasons. She stood behind the left seat and looked through the windshield. The creosote outside pressed its gray-green mass against the glass. From in here, the desert looked like it was trying to reclaim the cockpit first. She backed out without touching anything she did not need to. The cargo hold was vast in the way that empty industrial spaces are vast, more volume than the outside of the plane had seemed to promise. Her footsteps rang off the bare aluminum floor. The tie-down rings were still bolted in rows along the center line. A few wooden shipping pallets lay stacked and forgotten near the forward bulkhead. Whatever cargo this plane had last carried was gone, had been gone for a very long time, and the hold retained nothing of it except the abstract impression of weight and purpose. She walked the full length in under a minute. At the rear, a plywood partition had been installed across the full width of the fuselage, with a simple plank door set into it. The door was latched with a hook and eye closure. She unhooked it. Before that, the crawl space. She had noticed the floor access hatch near the midpoint of the hold, a rectangular panel with 2 quarter-turn fasteners. She knelt, worked both fasteners with the heel of her palm until they moved, and lifted the panel. Below was a maintenance passage maybe 18 inches high, running fore and aft between the structural ribs, smelling of rubber and old hydraulic fluid. She lowered herself in and moved on her elbows the length of the passage, checking the control cable runs, the hydraulic lines, the fuel crossfeed plumbing, not because she understood all of it, but because she wanted to understand the plane the way it was, before she made any decisions about what she would do inside it. Nothing was collapsed, nothing was wet. The plane was dry clear through. She climbed back up, latched the hatch, and went to the plywood door at the rear. She pushed it open. The space behind it was small, perhaps 10 feet of the fuselage length, given over to something that was not cargo. Two folding bunks were mounted to the port wall, one above the other. 4 wooden cabinets faced them on the starboard side. A narrow table was bolted to the rear bulkhead, and beneath it, a small sink with a hand pump handle stood waiting, patient as everything else in this aircraft. She did not move for a long moment. Then she stepped inside. She slept that first night on the lower bunk without unpacking her bag, coat pulled over her shoulders, listening to the desert settle around the fuselage, small contractions of cooling metal, a breath of wind along the underside, nothing more. By morning she had made a decision that was not really a decision, because it required no deliberation. She would stay until the place was clean. After that she would see. The rear cabin took most of the first day just to assess. She opened every cabinet slowly, treating each door as a question. What she found was modest: 2 wool blankets folded with military precision, a tin cup, a hand-crank flashlight whose spring had weakened but still threw light, 4 empty glass jars with lids, a rusted can opener, a coil of copper wire, and a small canvas roll of mechanics tools, 3 wrenches, 2 screwdrivers, a pair of pliers, which she set on the table with the care of someone cataloging something borrowed. The cabinets smelled of cedar and thyme. She noted everything in a pocket notepad she had carried since Tucson, writing in the compressed hand of someone who had learned to make supplies last. She found the well where a ring of flat stones suggested it, 40 yards off the port wingtip. The hand pump was seized. She worked the handle for 10 minutes before it gave. The first pull bringing up reddish water, the second brownish, the third something clearer that she let run onto the ground for a full minute before she filled a jar and held it to the light. No sediment. She carried water in every jar she had and began. The cleaning was not a single act but a series of them, each uncovering the next. She swept the cabin floor with a piece of sacking. She wiped the cabinets with dampened cloth and found beneath the grime that the wood was Douglas fir, still solid, the joints tight. She unfolded the bunks and found them serviceable. She worked the hand pump at the sink until the fitting gave and water came through into the small basin, brown, then pale, then clear, and she stood there a moment with her hands wet, acknowledging something. The window plexi had 2 long stress cracks, one on each side of the cabin. She found a piece of rigid plastic sheeting in the forward cargo hold, probably a protective cover for instruments, and cut it with a blade from the tool roll. The patches were not beautiful. They seated into the frames with a strip of foam weather tape she peeled from a seam along the cargo door. They held. They were enough. By the evening of the second day she had wiped down every surface, inventoried every cabinet, tested every fitting, patched both windows, and carried enough water to fill the sink tank to its brim. She sat at the narrow table with her notepad and the last light coming low and amber through the cockpit, and let herself be still. There was a loose panel she had noticed just aft of the cockpit door. She had been saving it. She went to it in the morning. The panel sat about 4 feet aft of the cockpit door, flush with the port side wall, its screws turned a quarter rotation out of true as if someone had opened it in a hurry and never quite finished closing it. She had noticed the gap on her first pass through the fuselage and had filed it away, the way she filed away most things, patient, deliberate, waiting for the right moment. She used the medium flathead from the tool roll. The first screw came out clean. The second resisted, then gave. The third was stripped, and she had to work the blade edge around its slot until the head caught and turned. The panel swung outward on a lower hinge she hadn't seen, and behind it was not insulation or wiring or the aluminum ribwork of the fuselage. Behind it was a steel box, welded flush into the wall, with a single latch handle and no lock. She pulled the handle. The latch turned. The box opened. The smell came first. Old leather, something like lanolin, dry paper and warm metal, and decades of sealed air releasing all at once into the desert morning. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked before she touched. 3 journals bound in dark brown leather, their spines cracked, their covers warped slightly from long storage. A manila envelope, thick, its brass brad still fastened. 2 sheets of paper folded together, the folds stiff, topographic hand drawings. She could see the contour lines even from outside the fold. And at the bottom, lying on the bare steel floor of the box, a brass key on a wire loop, a small paper tag threaded through the loop, 4 words written in faded blue ink. Hangar 3. And below that, a number she couldn't fully make out. She took everything to the narrow table and set it down without speaking, without thinking, just arranging it by type. Journals in a row, envelope to the right, maps beside it, key at the center, where she could see it. She opened the first journal. The handwriting was even and deliberate, the letters shaped like a man who had learned to write when penmanship still mattered. The first entry was dated March 1963. She read slowly, reading the way she read anything that mattered, absorbing it rather than scanning it. The pilot had run aerial photography surveys across Arizona and into New Mexico, contracting with mining companies and county governments and the occasional university, flying low and slow in careful grid patterns and photographing the land below in overlapping strips. He had done it alone, mostly. He wrote about the aircraft the way a farmer writes about land, not with sentiment exactly, but with a recognition of interdependence. She turned pages. She did not rush. By the third journal, the handwriting mentioned the valley, a narrow cut in the hills, southeast, a hard-packed strip, a hangar he had built with salvaged metal over 2 summers. She picked up the key. She read by candlelight both evenings, a pair of squat candles she'd found rolled in a cloth in one of the lower cabinets, still waxy and usable, which felt like the kind of small gift the desert occasionally offers to the patient. The first evening, she read straight through the first journal without stopping, and when the candle had burned low, she lit the second from it and kept going. The pilot wrote the way he apparently flew, methodically, with attention to detail without wasted motion. Survey contract received, flight planned, grid coordinates noted in columns so precise they looked typeset. Then, occasionally, a sentence that was not about coordinates at all. The light over the Mogollon Rim at 6 a.m. is a specific kind of orange I have not been able to describe adequately in 3 years of trying. She read that one twice. He had worked alone by preference, not by circumstance. That distinction was clear from the journals. He had hired a mechanic briefly in 1969, 2 seasons of work noted in terse appreciative entries, but otherwise he kept his own plane, filed his own flight plans, developed his own film in a portable darkroom he'd rigged in the rear of the cargo hold before the living space was built. The survey company existed on paper, but in practice it was 1 man, 1 aircraft, and an understanding of the Arizona sky that he had accumulated over decades, like a craftsman accumulates the weight of a tool in his hand. She cross-referenced the maps on the second evening, spreading both across the narrow table and weighting the corners with the journals themselves. The hand-drawn topographic lines were not perfectly scaled, but they were careful enough that she could orient them against the landmarks she'd seen on her walk-in, the ridgeline to the east, the cluster of ironwood trees near the well, the low saddle in the hills that the setting sun had framed in copper the first night. She traced the dry wash with her finger. It ran southeast from a point she could already roughly locate, following the natural drainage between two shallow ridges, and terminated, according to the notation in the third journal, cross-confirmed by a penciled arrow on the larger map, at a narrow cut in the hills. Valley entrance not visible from the wash until you are 30 yards in. He had written, designed that way. The key sat at the top corner of the larger map. She had moved it there without thinking, the way you move an important thing to where you can see it without looking directly at it. She studied the map until the candle guttered and the shadows pressed in close. Then she rolled both maps carefully, slid them back into the manila envelope with the photographs, and placed the journals on top. 4 miles, roughly, southeast. A dry wash she could find in the morning by starting at the ironwood trees and following the land where it wanted to go downhill. She set the key on the table beside her folded jacket and blew out the candle. She was moving before the light was full, before the ironwood trees were anything more than dark shapes against a sky the color of old pewter. The key was in her jacket pocket. The envelope was rolled inside a spare shirt and wedged at the top of the canvas bag, which she had left back in the cabin. She carried nothing this morning but water in an old tin canteen she had found in one of the lower cabinets, cleaned twice and filled from the well. The desert in early morning has a quality that the afternoon loses entirely, a stillness that is not silence, but something denser, like the land is holding something in. She walked into it. The ironwood trees gave her the starting point. The land east of them tilted almost imperceptibly, the way a table tilts when one leg is slightly short, and she let her feet read that grade and follow it south of east. The scrub here was dry brittlebush and creosote, the ground a pale clay that had cracked into polygons in the summer heat and not yet softened. Her boots raised small puffs of dust at each step. The dry wash materialized gradually, first as a slight depression, then as something more deliberate, a channel maybe 4 feet across, with walls of packed earth that held the ghost of water in their layering. She stepped down into it and followed it. The walking was easier there, the sandy floor compacted smooth by 10,000 years of occasional flooding, the brush pulling back to either side. The hills came up slowly on her left, then closer on her right, and the wash began to wind between them, tightening. She checked the angle of the sun. Roughly southeast. Correct. She almost missed the cut. The journal had warned her. Not visible until you are 30 yards in. What looked like solid hill face from the wash revealed itself, as she rounded a bend, to be an overlap, one ridge lying in front of another, creating a slot that read as shadow until you were standing almost inside it. She turned in. The passage was perhaps 12 feet wide, high-walled in sandstone and limestone, floored with the same fine sand as the wash. It ran for perhaps 200 yards before it opened. And there it was, larger than she had imagined, larger than the photographs had implied. The corrugated metal walls rose 12 feet at least, the roofline higher at its ridge, the whole structure the color of rust and pale lichen and years. It sat at the far end of a natural flat, roughly the width of a 2-lane road, scrub crowding its sides but leaving a clear apron in front, hard-packed dirt that might once have been a runway surface. She could see the faint parallel grooves of tire tracks still pressed into it. She walked to the main door, a padlock, large and weathered. She fit the brass key into it. One turn, the shackle released. She pushed the door open and stepped into the dark. The dark inside the hangar was not absolute. Light leaked in where the corrugated panels had parted at their seams, thin, bright lines of it falling across the floor in intervals, like something ruled with a straight edge. She stood still until her eyes adjusted. Then she began. The workbench ran the full length of the east wall, 8 feet of it, maybe 10, solid timber gone gray with age. Above it, a shadow board still hung, pegboard painted white, each tool's silhouette outlined in black paint so that whatever had been removed would leave its ghost behind. Most of the ghosts were filled. Wrenches in ascending order, screwdrivers, both flat and Phillips, pliers of 3 kinds, a hand drill with its bits nested in a cloth roll hanging from its own peg. She touched each one. The metal was furred with fine dust but sound underneath. No surface rust worth worrying about. She moved to the crates along the north wall. 4 of them, heavy wood, stenciled in black lettering that had faded to suggestions. She worked one lid free with a flat bar she found on the workbench. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and packed in excelsior, cylinder heads, a pair of them, cast iron, still faintly coated in the protective grease someone had thought to apply before sealing the lid. She did not know what engine they belonged to, but she understood what it meant that someone had packed them this carefully. The solar panels were bolted to a frame on the south-facing exterior wall. She had not noticed them from the outside, they were so low-mounted, and their cables ran through a conduit in the wall to a battery bank inside. 4 6-volt units wired in series and parallel both, sitting on a wooden shelf with a charge controller mounted above them. The controller was simple enough that its function was legible. She traced the wires, checked the connections. The batteries were old, but the cases were uncracked. She made no further judgment on them that day. Some things required patience before they would answer questions. The well was in the rear corner, covered by a square of plywood. She lifted it, rope, bucket, hand pump on a pipe beside it. The pump handle was stiff but moved. She worked it for a long time, 5 minutes, then 10, the resistance in it slowly softening as she primed it, air giving way to the sound of something moving up through the pipe from depth. When the water came, it was rust brown for 30 seconds, then the color of weak tea, then clear. She cupped a handful, let it go, pumped again, clear and cold, and she could smell nothing wrong in it. By late afternoon she had filled both her water bottles, washed her hands twice over, and written 3 pages in the small notebook she carried. The list of what was here, the list of what it might become. Outside, the valley had gone orange with the lowering sun. She walked the 4 miles back to the plane that evening, carrying nothing extra. The next morning she walked the 4 miles again, carrying everything useful she could manage. A coil of copper wire from a crate near the workbench, a flathead screwdriver whose handle fit her grip, 2 adjustable wrenches nested together and tied with a strip of cloth. She had found a canvas tool roll on a shelf and filled it before she left the valley. Her shoulder was sore before she had covered the first mile. That was the first trip. There were others. The route she had chosen along the dry wash was the easiest the terrain offered, which was not the same as easy. The wash ran for 2 miles before it widened and bent north, and after that the ground was open scrub, brittlebush, creosote, patches of caliche pale as chalk in the morning light. She learned where the loose stones gathered at the bend. She learned which hour made the last mile hardest. Late morning, the sun high enough to eliminate shadow and low enough to glare off the pale ground directly into her eyes. She began leaving the hangar earlier to avoid that hour, starting at first light when the desert was still in its brief cool and the sky was a color that had no name she knew for it. The silence on those walks was not empty. It was dense with small things. A cactus wren, working the ribs of a saguaro. The particular quality of wind that came down off the ridge at mid-morning, carrying a mineral smell she had come to recognize as the smell of rock warming. The way the dry wash muffled sound so that she could hear her own footsteps clearly. By the fourth trip, she was no longer watching the ground for obstacles. She had learned the ground. She began carrying more. A second coil of solar cable, stripped and measured at the workbench before she packed it. A cracked battery case she meant to inspect in better light. A folded section of corrugated metal she planned to use as a patch for one of the plane's ventilation covers. It was heavy and awkward, and she balanced it across both forearms and stopped 3 times. The desert in those hours had a quality she had not expected. Not hostility, which was what she had assumed of it at first, but indifference, which was different and more honest, and in a way more manageable. It did not care whether she was there or not. It applied the same heat to everything equally. Understanding that, she stopped bracing against it and started working with it, planning her loads by weight rather than volume, resting in the slim shadow of a rock formation at the midpoint, drinking before she was thirsty. The plane appeared on the horizon the same way each time, a dark shape, too deliberate for the landscape, too geometric. It always looked faintly impossible. She had been putting off the drive into Silver Mesa for reasons she did not fully examine. Partly it was the work, which gave every day a clear shape and made leaving feel like interruption. Partly it was something harder to name, a reluctance to carry the plane's story into a place where other people might have opinions about it. But the photograph decided it. One image in particular, pulled from the manila envelope, the plane parked on the airstrip in the narrow valley, the hangar visible behind it, and standing beside the nose wheel, a man in coveralls squinting into the sun. On the back, in pencil, Silver Mesa Air Survey, October '69. If anyone in that town remembered the company, they would remember something. She drove in on a Tuesday morning when the library was quiet. The county librarian, a deliberate woman who moved through the archive room as though she had memorized every drawer, found her 3 years of the Silver Mesa Gazette on microfiche and left her to it without further comment. She read for 2 hours. One small article from 1971 mentioned the survey company's dissolution following the owner's death. No heirs, no successor. That confirmed what the journals had already told her. It was on her way out that she stopped to pin the photograph to the public notice board. She was not sure why, some instinct about information moving in small towns rather than institutions, and the elderly man at the side table looked up from his coffee. He looked at the photograph for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "That's the old survey bird." His voice had the particular flatness of someone who has learned not to be surprised by things, but still cannot quite suppress the fact that he is. She took the photograph from the board and sat down across from him. He had worked for the company for 8 months in 1969, he said. Instrument calibration, mostly. Minor airframe repairs. He remembered the pilot as a precise, solitary man who kept careful records and flew the same routes, systematically, until he had photographed every square mile he set out to photograph. He remembered the plane because it had been a good one, a reliable airframe that the owner had converted himself with real care. When she told him where it was, he went still in a way that was not stillness, but the suppression of something. He asked twice if she was certain of the location. She showed him the maps. He was at the site 2 days later. She watched him walk toward the plane from 50 yards out, slowing as he approached, and she understood then that 23 years of not knowing what had become of something could settle into a person like sediment, and that what she was watching was that sediment finally shifting. He put his hand flat against the fuselage and did not speak for a while. He stayed for 2 hours. He told her what he knew, and what he knew was precise in the way that a man tells things he has carried a long time, not rehearsed, but worn smooth by their own weight. The pilot had died in March of 1971, not dramatically, a cardiac event, alone, in a rented room in Tucson. He had no family that anyone could locate. The survey company was a sole proprietorship filed under a corporate name he had registered in 1961, one of those paper constructions that small operators used for tax purposes, and when the owner died without a will, the company died with him in the way that things die when there is no one left to notice. The aircraft and the land and the hangar had not been abandoned in any deliberate sense. They had simply been left where they were, while the legal machinery that might have addressed them found other things to address. The county had made inquiries, he thought, early on. But the land parcel in the narrow valley was filed under the corporate name rather than the pilot's personal name, and the county recorder's records from that period were incomplete, and at some point the inquiry had simply stopped. She listened to all of this without interrupting. He was not a man who needed interrupting. He thought there was a good chance the valley parcel had never been formally reclaimed. He had followed such things loosely over the years, the way a person follows things they cannot quite let go of, and he had never heard of the land changing hands. He told her the name of the defunct company. He wrote it on a scrap of paper in block letters because he wanted her to have the spelling exactly right. He told her that the county recorder's office kept deed indexes going back to territorial days, and that a careful afternoon would tell her more than he could. She drove to the county seat the following morning. The recorder's office occupied a low adobe building with a ceiling fan that turned slowly and accomplished little. The clerk was patient with her questions, which she had organized before walking in. It took most of the afternoon, working through deed indexes and cross-referencing the corporate name against parcel maps, but the record, when she found it, was unambiguous. The narrow valley parcel had been filed in 1963 under the survey company's name, and nothing subsequent appeared. No transfer, no government reclamation, no tax lien resolution. It sat in the index the way an object sits in a drawer that no one has opened, present and uncontested and waiting for whoever finally arrived with the right question. She asked the clerk what a person would need to file a quiet title claim on an unclaimed parcel. The clerk set a form on the counter. She picked it up and read it carefully, standing at the counter, not yet ready to sit down. She filled out the form at the counter, using the clerk's pen, asking once about a phrase she didn't understand. The clerk explained it without condescension. She filed it before the office closed. The drive back to Silver Mesa took 40 minutes on a road that ran straight into the declining sun. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way the desert looked at that hour, quiet, clarified, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. The following 2 weeks, she worked without urgency, which was new for her. The solar panels at the hangar were her first project. She cleaned the contacts, replaced 2 corroded cable connections using wire from the spare crates, and tested the battery bank with a voltmeter she found in the workbench drawer. By the 3rd day, the charge indicator climbed into the middle range and held. She ran a line from the battery bank along the dry wash and into the rear cabin, enough current for a single work light and a small radio she found wrapped in a cloth in one of the wooden cabinets. The radio picked up a station from Tucson on clear nights. She cleared the airstrip in stages, 7 days of walking the length of it with a long-handled rake, filling potholes with compacted gravel hauled in the truck bed, pulling creosote that had taken root along the center line. She did not clear it because she intended to fly. She cleared it because the old pilot had built it carefully, and it deserved to be what it was. On the last evening, she did not plan it deliberately. She finished the final section of the airstrip as the light was dropping, and walked back to the plane because the water tank needed checking. She climbed the ladder at the cargo door, moved through the cabin, and continued forward through the narrow passage to the cockpit, without thinking about it very specifically. She sat down in the left seat. The windshield was clean. She had scrubbed it 2 weeks earlier, and the desert dust had not yet returned in force. Through it she could see the airstrip running southeast, pale gravel against darker scrub, the corrugated hangar roof just visible at the far end, where the valley notched the hills. The sun was behind the western ridgeline. The first stars were appearing, faint and then less faint. She rested her hands on the control yoke the way a person rests their hands on a windowsill when they are looking at something they do not need to say anything about. She had sat in this seat before, early on, for a few minutes, curious, unsteady, not yet sure what any of it meant. The seat had felt like trespassing. It did not feel that way now. The airstrip was hers. The valley parcel was hers. The journals were hers to keep and understand. She was not passing through. She had arrived.